Champagne in a shoe. If you haven't already guessed, today's lecture is on sparkling wine, that libation that tickles the senses and brightens celebrations. It's also one of the least understood wines, as most people just kick it back at New Year's or weddings without any thought. But some of these wines are so elegant that they exemplify what we mean by the descriptor finesse. This lecture will not only add another crayon to your new box of colors, but will also help you expand your enjoyment of these wines. Now for today's lecture, you will need the following wines: a non-vintage champagne, a Cava, a Prosecco, a California sparkling wine, a Moscato d'Asti, and a Bracchetto. Now pour yourself a glass of champagne, the non-vintage champagne. And before we get started, I'd like to propose a toast of champagne to you all. And we'll quote Napoleon when I say, "Champagne, in victory you deserve it, in defeat you need it." Cheers. Okay, I didn't just want to toast you. I wanted you to calibrate your palate for sparkling wine. Sparkling can be quite high in acid, and it takes a little to get used to. This will make it easier for you to taste later on. Now come back in time with me. Where did sparkling wine begin? You might think that sparkling wine began with a Benedictine monk named Dom Pérignon, or that it was invented by the French, but both are myths. They did contribute a lot to quality, but they did not invent sparkling wine. In fact, for most of his life, Dom Pérignon tried to figure out a way to get the bubbles out of his wines. Actually, it's hard to find the place in history where sparkling wine began, as bubbles are part of the fermentation process. Remember when we said sugar plus yeast equals alcohol and carbon dioxide? If any of the carbon dioxide is prevented from escaping the fermentation vessel, it dissolves into the liquid and causes effervescence, or bubbles. This happens naturally. However, for most wines, this is seen as a fault, as who wants a sparkling Napa Cab or a red Bordeaux? While we don't know who first realized that effervescence can be a wonderful quality, we do know that the British were the first to create bottles strong enough to contain sparkling wine. You see, the bubbles create pressure, so each bottle is highly pressurized. In champagne, there is 3 times the pressure of a car tire in every bottle, so early bottles frequently exploded. In the mid-1600s, the British developed charcoal-fired glass. It had a stronger structure than the wood-fired glass, which was used by the French, and without success. Within a couple of decades, though, the French acquired this technology and were soon capitalizing on it. We'll begin with champagne, the best known of all sparkling wines. Now, all champagne is sparkling wine, but not all sparkling wine is champagne. The primary reason for this is that Champagne is a name of a region in France. And sparkling wine from that region sets the benchmark for all of the others. Even people in the industry get this confused. One day I was taping a Fox Business segment at the Bull and Bear Steakhouse at the Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan, and I ordered a glass of champagne from the bar. The bartender got out a bottle of Cava. While done in the traditional method, as we'll discuss later, this sparkler was from Spain, not champagne. And when I asked if he had any champagne, he said, "This is champagne." And I said, "Well, no, this is Cava." And he said, "Look, champagne comes from everywhere." So if you previously called all sparklers champagne, don't worry, you're not alone. But now you can get it right. Champagne is about 90 miles or 145 kilometers northeast of Paris, and it's tiny. Think about it. All of the champagne at every party going on in the world right now and throughout the year comes from a region about 7 times smaller than Rhode Island. In this region, how many growers do you think there are? 100? 500? 1,000? Try over 17,000. These growers own about 90% of the vineyards, and they sell their grapes to champagne houses, who have the equipment and the capital expenditure to be able to produce champagne. I mean, it's a very expensive process. There are more than 250 champagne houses called négociants manipulants, or NM, and they produce about 2/3 of champagne, but they only own 10% of the vineyards. Those growers who do make their own champagne are called récoltants manipulants, or RM. Now, look at the label on your bottle of non-vintage champagne. This label will tell you who made the champagne. A champagne house, an NM, we see here on this bottle of Piper Heidsieck. However, this is not an indicator of quality, just an indicator of who made it. Today, of all sparkling wines, champagne symbolizes luxury, symbolizes celebration and sin. This is not by accident, and this reputation was created in three ways. First, Champagne was where all of the kings of France were anointed and crowned, from Philippe Auguste in 1179 to Charles X in 1825. As a center of attention for French royalty, the region's sparkling wine got more notice than it otherwise might have had. Second, the champagne houses themselves created their own PR campaigns. For instance, in 1785, Florent Louise Heidsieck of Piper Heidsieck presented a bottle of champagne to Marie Antoinette, and because of her patronage, we're still talking about this brand today. Now, about 40 years later, while his cousin Christian Heidsieck managed the house and made the champagne, Henri Guillaume Piper worked on convincing all the royal courts of Europe to make their champagne the royal house champagne. In today's terms, we call this celebrity endorsement, and it still works today, whether we're talking about the rapper Jay-Z, his preference for Ace of Spades, or the actress Scarlett Johansson, her advertising campaign with Moet and Chandon. Lastly, champagne always carried around scandal with it. Now let's face it, the carbon dioxide in sparkling wine makes the alcohol move through your bloodstream faster and to your head quicker. The Duc de Richelieu blamed champagne for its debauchery when he said, "The orgies never started until everyone was in a state of joy that champagne brings." These are the three reasons why champagne has always had a connection to aristocracy, celebrity, and sin. And it may be why we still associate it with celebration and luxury today. Now let's move on to how champagne is made. Champagne, like any wine, starts with grapes. Unlike other wines, however, champagne starts out with 2 red grapes and 1 white. Surprised? Don't be. Remember from lecture 4 that all grape juice is white unless the juice sits in contact with the skins? The 3 grape varieties are Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, which is a red grape, and Chardonnay. 2 of these are noble varieties which we discussed in earlier lectures. Each of these grapes has its own purpose, which many in the industry don't even know. The winemaker uses these grapes to make distinct styles. For example, champagnes that predominate in red grapes, such as the Piper Heidsieck, will be fuller in body and more aromatic. Remember from lecture 6 that Pinot Noir is a very aromatic grape variety. Now, champagne that are only made from Chardonnay, called Blanc de Blanc, or that predominate in Chardonnay, such as a brand called Taittinger, have a leaner structure, lighter body, higher acid, and more neutral aromatics. What you blend and how you blend it are stylistic decisions by the winemaker. When these grapes are harvested, they are brought to the pressing house, and the juice is brought to the fermentation vessels. Most of these are inert vessels, such as stainless steel, but some houses such as Bollinger, Krug, and the champagne grower we mentioned before, Villemar, they ferment in barrel, which, as we know from previous lectures, can affect its structure and flavor. After fermentation is complete and all the sugar has turned into alcohol, we know we have what's called vin clair. But it has no bubbles in it. It's still wine. So it's at this point the champagne winemaker does his blending to determine type. He blends grape varieties, regions, vintages, as most champagne has a non-vintage designation. After the cuvée or blend is complete, then they add more sugar and more yeast in the form of a solution and add it to the cuvée. And they put it in a bottle and close the bottle with a crown cap or a beer cap. Then they lay the bottles down to age. Now, 2 things happen when the bottles are laying there quiet. First, a second fermentation happens, whereby the yeast has been metabolizing the sugar they added and forms carbon dioxide. But because the bubbles can't escape because of that crown cap, it dissolves into the liquid. And the longer the bottles age, the carbon dioxide dissolves into the liquid more, and the smaller the bubbles get. Now, these tiny bubbles are important for fine mousse. That's the froth you get on top. And for the texture in the mouth. So the smaller the bubble, the higher the quality. Now, what I'd like for you to do is pick up your glass of non-vintage champagne, and we're going to test this texture in the mouth. So I want you to pick up the champagne, roll it around your tongue. I want you to press your tongue up against your palate and really try to feel the texture of that mousse and the fineness of those bubbles. And now what I want you to do is pick up the bottle, or the glass, rather, of Prosecco. Now, these are made in different methods. But if you really try to feel the texture of those bubbles, can you notice a difference? You'll probably find that the champagne is finer and the bubbles are smaller. And this is the reason why we care. We care because the finer or the smaller the bubble, the finer the mousse. The finer the mousse, the finer the texture. The finer the texture, the higher the quality. Now, another thing that happens while the bottles are laying down is something called autolysis. And there's a word you hear in reviews and with critics called the champagne had great autolytic character. I'll teach you what this word means and you'll look so posh at cocktail parties. What happens is, as the bottle is laying down, you have the yeast that metabolizes the sugar. But this only takes about 2 weeks or so. So then why is the legal minimum for non-vintage champagne 15 months? And for vintage, it's about 3 years. The reason is autolysis. Now, what happens is, when the yeast finish metabolizing the sugar, they die. And these single-celled organisms, their cell wall breaks down and releases compounds into the wine. Some nitrogenous compounds, some acetyl compounds, and even a little glycerol, which creates a biscuity, toasty, yeasty kind of character. But it also adds a little bit more weight. Now, what I'd like for you to do is smell your champagne and smell the Prosecco, and then go back to the champagne. You'll probably find that the champagne is much more yeasty and toasty. This is what we mean by autolytic character. Once the bubbles are the right size and have the desired autolytic character, the winemaker gets the yeast sludge out of the bottle. This must be done slowly and carefully because if the bottle is moved too quickly, the yeast sludge goes everywhere and then they have to wait for it all to settle again. So the winemaker must slowly coax the yeast into the neck of the bottle. This is a process called riddling. Now, traditionally, the bottles were placed in riddling racks that have a A shape and they're wooden, and they've got holes in them to fit the bottles. Legend has it that in the early 1800s, Madame Veuve Clicquot, the namesake of the famous champagne house, took over her husband's champagne business when he died. Now, back in her day, champagne was either decanted to remove the yeast sludge, or it was poured into colored glasses so you really couldn't tell. Well, as the legend goes, one evening she was sitting at her wooden table in the kitchen. Suddenly she sprang up and started hacking at the wooden table with an axe, making an A-frame and making holes in it that we come to know as a riddling rack. Now, within the riddling rack, by slowly turning the bottles and eventually getting it sur point, or on its point, so on its head, the yeast sludge moves to the neck of the bottle, while leaving the rest of the liquid inside clear. Though riddling racks are still used for some very large format bottles, nowadays practically all houses use machines to do this in a much faster and more efficient way. Once the yeast is in the neck, The winemakers place the neck in a brine solution to freeze it as a solid. To dislodge the yeast sludge solid from the neck of the bottle, all they have to do is loosen the crown cap. Because there's now 6 atmospheres of pressure behind the cap, the solid will just blast out. This is a process called disgorgement. Now, once the lees have been disgorged, the bottle has to be topped up before they can cork it, wire cage it, and label it. It's at this stage that a solution of wine and sugar called dosage is added. Dosage determines the sweetness style of champagne. The driest style, meaning least sweet, is when no sugar is added. This is called brut nature or zero dosage, and these can be quite austere. If the wine has less than 15 grams per liter residual sugar, it's called brut. Now, if you had this level of sugar in a still wine, meaning no bubbles in it, it would taste sweet. But because champagne itself is highly acidic, and even carbon dioxide is slightly acidic and gives an impression of acidity, the champagne needs a little sugar to be more in balance. Now, after brut comes additional tiers of graduating sweetness. Extra dry, which ironically is sweeter than brut, sec, and demi-sec, and doux, which is the sweetest, which has over 50 grams per liter residual sugar. And voila, we have champagne. When the second fermentation is carried out in the bottle, as it is with champagne, it's referred to as the traditional method, or what used to be called méthode champenoise. A number of wines around the world model this method used in champagne, such as Franciacorta in Italy and Cava in Spain. Franciacorta comes from the Lombardia region in Italy and is made from Chardonnay and from Pinot Noir grapes, and as well as from the other Pinot family, so Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris, or what it's called in Italian, Pinot Nero, Pinot Grigio, and Pinot Bianco. The wine is fully sparkling, meaning it approaches about 6 atmospheres of pressure that we mentioned earlier. Now, the Italian word for fully sparkling is spumante. Franciacorta is spumante, and it can be of great value and quite high quality, though it generally lacks acidity, finesse, and mineral character of champagne. Now to Spain. Cava comes from the Penedès region in northeastern Spain. The traditional grapes used are Macabeo, Parellada, and Xarel·lo. These are all white grape varieties that are indigenous to Spain, but you do see more and more producers using Chardonnay in the blend. While Macabeo and Parellada add a lemony character, one of the grapes, Xarel·lo, adds a unique flavor that has become Cava's benchmark aroma: burnt rubber or earth. Now, I know it doesn't sound appetizing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's become its calling sign. What I want you to do is take your, let's say, California sparkling wine, and I want you to smell that. Now, remember that smell. I want you to take your Cava and smell that. Now, you may not call it burnt rubber, but it is a bit earthier in its tones. Do you get the aromatic difference? Now, if you can, sparkling wine is kind of hard and it's very, very delicate. So if you didn't get it, don't worry. But the more you practice, the better you're going to get. Now, just like champagne, Cava's secondary fermentation is carried out in bottle. However, its aging requirements are much shorter, which focuses the wine more on its youthful, upfront fruitiness, rather than any great autolytic character. Cavas are generally great value sparklers, and you can find them at entry-level to moderate price ranges. This means you really shouldn't feel guilty about popping it open without a special occasion or blending it on Sunday brunch for mimosas. In the New World, again, meaning outside of Europe, we see a number of producers that employ the traditional method. Take the California sparkling wine we have here. It's called Piper Sonoma, which comes from California. But you also see wines from all over the United States, Chile. Here we have one from South Africa, Tasmania, Australia, New Zealand, and they generally use the same grape varieties and method you see in champagne. Mostly you see the grapes of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Now, take your California sparkler, and then take your champagne. And And I want you to smell the differences between these two. Now, what do you notice in the aromatics immediately? I notice that in the California sparkler, you see the fruit is much more pronounced and upfront. Again, this is the difference between New World and Old World wines. However, in the Champagne, you notice much more autolytic character. It's more toasty, biscuity, and it has stronger mineral tones in it. Now, I would like for you to taste the California sparkling wine. You can practically taste the California sunshine because the fruit is more pronounced and it's a little bit broader on the palate, so the acidity is a little bit less. And the Champagne, if you go back to it, you're going to find it has a much leaner structure, higher level of acid, more mineral tones, and again, that autolytic character. We've spoken of the traditional method, but there are other ways to produce sparkling wine. Remember how in traditional method, the second fermentation was done in bottle. They added the sugar and the yeast to the bottle and they closed it with a beer cap, remember? While in the tank method, or Charmat method, as used for Prosecco, Moscato d'Asti, Asti Spumante, and others, the second fermentation is done in stainless steel tank, not a bottle. And they generally don't let the wine linger on the lees for very long because they don't really want autolytic character. Now, what difference do you think this will make to the sparkling wine versus the traditional method? First, the carbon dioxide won't dissolve as much into the liquid because it's not held there as long as with the traditional method. Also, there's more wine in the tank than in the small volume of the bottle, so the bubbles themselves are larger. Remember when we tasted the Champagne and the Prosecco earlier? The Prosecco's bubbles were larger. We were talking about the texture of the mousse. We also noticed that the character of the wine was more upfront in its fruit and less in its autolytic character than the Champagne. That's because most Prosecco is made using the tank method. Prosecco is the name of the grape and the wine made in the Veneto region of Italy. Now, what I want you to do is smell the Prosecco again. Notice that it has a very soft floral character to it. But you do notice the fruit more so than in the Champagne, but it does have a soft fruity tone to it. Now, Proseccos can be an incredible value. Let's go on to the Moscato d'Asti. Now, a friend of mine calls this her favorite jacuzzi wine, and it's easy to see why. And this is also made in the tank method. It's made from a grape called Muscato, or Muscat. And it's one of the most fragrant grapes on the planet. Now, what I want you to do is that chest, chin, nose test. Hold your Moscato d'Asti here. Chances are you're already going to begin to smell it right here. It's really the flavor, the aromas are just jumping out of the glass. Now I want you to put it at your chin. Wow, it's quite intense, but you're going to get a little bit more perfumed aromas. Now I want you to stick your nose in the glass and really smell in a way where you're going to get everything that's in there. Wow. The typical notes for Moscato d'Asti, it really smells of roses, rose petals, orange blossom, and I even get a little bit of ginger. Now this is an indigenous grape variety to Piemonte, and in the industry, we call the smell of this grape, we say it's grapey, which is kind of silly actually, because of course Moscato is a grape, but it has more of a grapey kind of aroma. And this is the same for Asti Spumante. Now remember, Spumante means fully sparkling, and the Moscato d'Asti is actually frizzante. And for Moscato, the aromatics, the intense aromatics that we get with these wines is the same all over the world. Now what I want you to do is taste the Moscato d'Asti versus the Prosecco. What did you notice right away? Yeah, it's sweet. But also, going back to the Prosecco and then going back to the Moscato d'Asti, you see how soft it feels. And this is because it has really low acid and really low alcohol. It's probably about 5% or so. Now, the Prosecco, if you go taste the Moscato first and then you go back to the Prosecco, that sweetness is going to make the Prosecco taste sour. Lastly, we have a Bracchetto, which is a grape from, also from Italy, and it's an Italian sparkler. Now, the legend is that you would serve Bracchetto to your mistress, not to your wife. So be careful on who you serve this to. But it's a gorgeous, gorgeous pink color. But this is also extremely aromatic as well. I mean, not as much as the Moscato d'Asti, but it is very aromatic. The fruit flavors, the raspberry tails just jump out of the glass right at you. And when you taste it, it's very sweet, also low in acid, but feel the size of those bubbles too. This demonstrates that it's tank method as well. And the Moscato d'Asti, as well as the Bracchetto, can be really great entry-level sparklers. So if you hear people say, oh, I hate champagne and I generally hate sparkling wines, show them these. They'll probably love them. We'll discuss how to pair these wines with food in Lecture 24. But for now, let's talk about how to serve sparkling wine. Now, most people serve sparkling wine entirely too cold, which will mute the already subtle flavors of all champagne. It should be served about 45 degrees Fahrenheit or about 7 degrees Celsius, but the temperature of most refrigerators we have is about 35 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit or a little over 2 degrees Celsius. So this is much colder than what we want. So if you chill it, don't do so for too long. You can also chill sparkling wine in an ice bucket. Fill an ice bucket 3/4 of the way with water and then put equal quantities of ice and water. The bottle is surrounded by ice water. This is a faster way to chill champagne if you have guests coming over in in less than a half an hour. Now, I repeat, do not put the sparkling wine in the freezer. There is a possibility that it can burst if you put it in the freezer, and you don't want wine and glass bits all over your groceries. Now, I'm going to teach you how to properly open a bottle of champagne. Again, it should be chilled, again, about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason why is because then it's less combustible. And what you want to do is you want to remove the foil. I've already removed it for you here. And here's a cute little party piece of trivia here. It always takes 6 twists to get the wire cage off. So we'll try it, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then what you do, you always put your thumb right on top of it because you don't want it exploding. When I was in, and you want to put a towel over it as well. When I was in Aspen, I was at a particular food and wine festival, and the wines there were way too combustible, and I was just opening everything quickly, and one of the corks just grazed my cheek. So really, please be careful. Now, in order to do this, you want to tilt the bottle, and you want to wrap your left hand around the cork. And you want to have a firm grip with your right hand at the base of the bottle. And what you're going to do is you're going to rotate your right hand. You're going to rotate the bottle. You're not going to rotate the cork. Now, it should make that soft sound. Nothing like NASCAR, like it, exploding everywhere, as you normally see. Now, this may be a little off color, but when I was in Champagne, they said to me, it should sound like the whisper of a lady, not the fart of a whore. So now for a very fun way to open up a bottle of champagne. It's called sabering. That is, using a sword to open up a bottle. Now, don't try this at home unless you've been taught by a person in person who can be there with you to demonstrate Now, where this comes from is from Napoleonic times. Napoleon was going through the region of Champagne with a victory, and the people of Champagne wanted to celebrate by handing the guys on horseback the bottles of champagne to celebrate. So, unfortunately, it's difficult to open up a bottle of champagne while you're sitting on a horse. So what they did is they would take their swords and they'd hack off the end of it. Now, how this works is physics. What happens when you make a bottle of champagne is that two halves come together and form a vertical seam around the bottle. And where that seam meets the lip is the weakest point of the champagne bottle. And all you have to do pretty much is tap it and it's going to go flying. Remember, there's 3 times the pressure of a car tire in every bottle of champagne. So if the bottle is dropped or it's too warm, it can explode and it can be quite dangerous. 3, 4, 5, 6. Remember that little piece of trivia? And you want to hold it up, see, about 45 degrees so it doesn't spill on the floor. We ready? 1, 2, 3. And there we have it. Next lecture, we move on to the world of fortified wines, ports, sherries, and more. You want to make sure you have the following wines ready. A ruby port from Portugal, a tawny port, again, from Portugal, a fino sherry, it could be a manzanilla as well, a amontillado, or an oloroso, a Madeira, and an Australian sticky, if you can find it. This is another category few know a lot about, but they are decadently delicious and go great at the end of the meal. These are also wines you can buy to celebrate the birth of your newborn child and be able to open and drink it with him or her on his or her 21st birthday or wedding. But until then, I'm going to leave you with a toast, my favorite toast. May all of your joys be pure joys, and all of your pain, champagne. Cheers.